Hi, everybody. I'm Myron Medcalf of the Mary Ann Key Book Club, joined by Lindsay Peifer, who is the National Education Association Senior Program Policy Analyst and Specialist focusing on AAPI outreach and engagement. We're here for another edition of our video series talking about Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong, which has just been an incredible book. Lindsay, we obviously talked about the first couple chapters in our first video. The next couple chapters, the end of white innocence and bad English. My thought was, when I first read the autobiography of Malcolm X, I just remember how it made me feel and how I could connect to this young man's experience of feeling as if he was growing up in a world that didn't want him, and at a minimum didn't want to make the effort to understand him. And I hear some of the same things when I read Minor Feelings. So I'm curious, reading this for you, how did it make you feel?
That's a great question. I feel like in this chapter in particular, what really resonated, and I think it's, so she has a quote, and it's actually, she's quoting somebody else, Susie Rotolo, and she says, going back to the civil rights movement, and what they were seeing was pure, unadulterated white racism was splattered all over the media as the violence against the civil rights workers escalated. And then she continues to say, we might ask ourselves what has helped fuel our country's wistfully manufactured screen memory. Wishing for innocent times means fetishizing an era when the nation was violently hostile to anyone different. Movies are cast as if the country were still protected by white supremacist law that guarantees that only Americans seen are carefully curated European descendants. And so I feel like we are in a moment that is similar to that. We are also seeing unadulterated racism. We are seeing a division in our country. And I want to have that question, like, we might ask ourselves what is causing that division. We might ask ourselves why we are seeing continuing to see racist attacks on AAPI people, which are still happening, even though that the media coverage has stopped, right? Which also makes me think about a quote that she says earlier in the book that she wrote, Americans have an expiration date on race the way they do for grief. At some point, they expect you to get over it. So like the media coverage has stopped, and we are supposed to get over the violence as it's still happening, as we're still experiencing it as a community. So I feel like there's this question that I want us all to be asking ourselves, and in that sense of what can we do to shift that narrative, right? Like, what can we do to interrupt, all of these attacks on school boards, right? Wanting to attack critical race theory when really educators are trying to teach truth and being honest and being inclusive, right? Because it feels like right now those attacks are all just flashing back to the unadulterated white racism that's asking us to protect the status quo.
I think that's so accurate in that we're often asked to protect white feelings at the expense of ourselves. We want you to shrink, be smaller, minimize how you feel, minimize your experiences, because we don't want to navigate the guilt attached to that, if that's what some people feel. I also think if you're white in this country, you could ignore history if you'd like to do that. But if you're not white, it's impossible because you're still living in the aftermath of those things that have happened. And speaking of that, in The End of White Innocence, there's so much powerful writing in this. First, she's just a great writer,
yes,
but also just a really powerful writer. Like Kathy Park Hong does not waste words. And I just love how the different parallels between the AAPI community and the Black community and just sort of these historic moments she shows. But she says, the flip side of innocence is shame. When Adam and Eve lost their innocence, their eyes were open and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. Shame is that sharp, prickling awareness that I'm exposed, like the inflamed ass of a baboon. It's a neurotic, self-inflicting wound. Even if the aggressor who caused me shame is no longer my life, I imagine he is, and I shrink from my shadow that I mistake for him. She goes on to say, shame squats over my face and sits. Shame is often associated with Asianness and the Confucian system of honor alongside its incomprehensible rites of shame. But that is not the shame I'm talking about. My shame is not cultural, but political. It is being painfully aware of the power dynamic that pulls at the levers of social interactions and the cringing indignity of where I am in that order, either as the afflicted or as the afflictor. And I read that and I was like, let me drop the book and let me just think, because she said so much in that passage. I'm wondering how you process that and just the way she sees shame and what it meant to her and how it affected her.
There's so much to break down in that quotation, right? Like in terms of shame, and also what you're talking about in terms of white guilt and white tears that she talks about as well in this chapter. But also that last line, like to be, what was that last line again?
She says, it is being painfully aware of the power dynamic that pulls at the levers of social interactions and the cringing indignity of where I am in that order, either as the afflicted or as the afflictor.
Right, the afflicted or the inflictor. And I feel like I feel like we're all on this journey, right? And we all bring some kind of, I shouldn't say all, but there are many times where we bring privilege into space and when we're bringing that into a space, we have to be aware of the privilege that we're bringing into a space is what I'm trying to say. Because to be the inflictor, right? And it talks about how I feel like the answer is always being in solidarity with other people. The answer is to understand where we are on our own journey, to understand our own implicit biases so that we are not inflicting harm on other people. And she talks about it in the next chapter too. This idea I think is so beautiful about speaking nearby, right? And the idea that when you decide to speak nearby, rather than speak about, the first thing you need to do is acknowledge the possible gap between you and those who, and this was a filmmaker, populate your film. But I feel like, what if we all took that idea of that we don't have to be the expert, right? The representative of our communities, that we get to have space to be who we are ourselves individually, to be able to speak by, that also gives space to people to learn, to grow, to be on this journey together. And we could talk about this for a long time, but I know that we're coming to the end of our time together in this conversation. But hopefully this just makes people start thinking about what conversations that you're having in your own communities and getting them ready for the next events with us.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to it.